Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like-minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but 2 of my last 3 trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler, and thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. Amateur Traveler Podcast, Episode 52. This week, the Amateur Traveler Podcast goes back to Tanzania for Part 2. I mentioned in Part 1 that Part 1 was going to be Tanzania as a tourist, and Part 2 is going to be a little different, and Part 2 is going to be Tanzania as a guest, or as you'd say in Swahili, an mgeni. And mgeni is the phrase in Swahili which means both stranger and guest, and that tells you a little something about the Tanzanian culture. Before we get back to Africa, I have a few news stories that I'd like to point out. Links to all of these stories will be at the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. The first one is a piece of good news for me. I had heard that this was coming, but I didn't want to spill the beans until it happened. If you look at the September issue of Men's Journal, which is about adventure travel, or adventure life, I believe is the subtitle of it, you'll see they have a list of the 4 best adventure podcasts, and the Amateur Traveler makes that list. And thanks to Wes, who put a comment on my MySpace to let me know about that coming out. I hadn't heard yet. And they give the Amateur Traveler a B+, which I think is fairly fair, since the Amateur Traveler podcast is not always about adventure travel. And their description reads, well-traveled host Chris Christensen delivers practical advice on more than 50 destinations. I think I fared a little better than Rick Steves Europe, who got a B, and his description is interviews with super knowledgeable guests make up for dull caller questions, which I thought was a little mean. I'd like to point out that there is no truth to the rumor that the tropical storm Chris was named after me, and I found it a little depressing when it was downgraded to a depression. The title for the world's largest cruise ship is now shared between 2 of the ships from Royal Caribbean as they launched the Liberty of the Seas, which joins the Freedom of the Seas as the largest cruise ship. Now, whether a large cruise ship is a good idea, I'll let you judge, but at least it's a little better news than some of the recent stories about cruise ships listing and injuring people, or the people getting sick on cruise ships. The Bureau of Transportation Statistics has come out with the stats for airline on-time arrivals for June. They have slipped overall, but the three leading airlines with the best on-time arrival rates are Hawaiian Air's, Aloha Airlines, and SkyWest Airlines. And the three worst with the lowest on-time arrival rates are Atlantic Southeast Airlines, ATA Airlines, and Mesa Airlines. More details to that in the show notes. So I recently got back from a 2-week trip to Tanzania, as you heard in last week's show. And an interesting thing happened after the first 3 days. We went to the game parks, which I talked about in last week's show, and had a wonderful time. And it was really fascinating to see and great and terrific to be in Africa. And someone said at that point, well, would you come back? And my reaction was, well, I'm not sure. I've really enjoyed everything I've seen, but now I've seen it. And there are so many other places in the world that I haven't seen. So what would bring me back is the people that we meet in the rest of the trip. And so this particular part will talk about the people we met and the things I learned about Tanzania. The very first thing we did after we sort of went out of tourist mode, and again I was on a trip with 9 other people from my church, and it was probably best described as a service trip, and we'll get into some of the details later on. But the very first thing we did is we went to Selian Hospital, and Selian Hospital, like many things I'll mention in this show, is a Lutheran hospital, and the church I go to happens to be a Lutheran church, and Tanzania was colonized by Germans first of all, and so the Lutheran Church has a fairly big presence there. But the Selian is a Lutheran hospital, and we went there. And the very first experience we had was going into the chapel that they were having in the morning. And the hymn that closed last week's show and opened this week's show is what they were singing very first thing when we came in there. And one of the things you notice when you start spending time with Tanzanians, 2 interesting things actually. One is they speak very softly. And I asked someone at one point, why is it that Tanzanians speak so softly? And they said, if you speak loudly, people will assume you're angry. And it made it a little tougher for me. I had been studying Swahili in preparation for coming to this trip. And so I understood enough Swahili, for instance, to understand that this hymn we were singing, we are going someplace. Nitakwenda. I am going. Ni is I, ta is future tense, and kwenda is to go. So nitakwenda. And I didn't understand until later on that we were going to heaven, which is good if we're going someplace and we're singing a hymn in a chapel. Was glad that it was someplace nice. But so I found it a little difficult to understand Swahili sometimes because people speak so softly. But when they sing, and I just hope that all of you get a chance sometime to spend some time with Tanzanians singing. And we're in the chapel. There is no instrumentation. They're singing in lots of different parts, and as soon as someone starts singing, we saw this with the children, which we'll talk about later on, I just really thoroughly enjoyed spending any time with any large group of Tanzanians that burst into song. We stayed for the morning report, where the doctors checked in with all of the new patients that had been checked into the hospital and the 3 who had died the previous day. And all 3 had died because of complications basically related to AIDS. And that's a problem that East Africa in general is facing in a very serious way. And you'll hear more about that as I go on. And I should tell you that this podcast will be a little more PG-13 related because I will talk about serious issues like AIDS and HIV. And after that, we met our guide who would show us around the hospital, who was a very personable Australian named Sarah. Here we started talking a little about learning Swahili.
Kidogo. How did you learn Swahili? Just by being here, or?
No, I studied it before we came.
Oh, okay. Gosh, that's good. I knew the word for banana and the word for coffee when I first
Your
arrived.
Your diet must be fairly limited.
Yeah.
The road out to Selian Hospital, which is in Arusha, is a challenging road, especially for the bus that we were in. It's a dirt road with all sorts of ruts in it, and Sarah told us a little bit about the new hospital going in town.
They're hoping to attract a different group of people to the town hospital. Ones who aren't very happy about bumping out the road to Tony.
We wondered about it. We decided you couldn't be an emergency.
No, and I tell you, they've just fixed up the road after the rain. Oh, very good. So this hospital is largely recognised through Maasai land as a sort of Maasai safe hospital, and there's a lot of Maasai who will come to this hospital, seek out this hospital because there are people who speak Maasai, because they're not, maybe there's a great degree of sort of tribalism, in the same way that there might be racism in other places, that other tribes maybe sometimes look down on the Maasai, for all their exoticness and what have you. They see them as a little bit tough or dirty. And yet here, is a very safe place for them to come and to be treated.
Now I should pause and put some of Sarah's comments into context. She talked about tribalism, and certainly there's some of that, she said, as the people look at the Maasai, who are the only one of the tribes really that's keeping their traditional ways. But we're not talking about what happened, for instance, in Rwanda with the genocide being the final result of the rivalry between the Tutsi and the Hutu. Tanzania actually offers... One of the gifts that they give the world at this time is the ability to get along. Tanzania is composed of 120 different tribes, and religiously it's about 40% Christian, 40% Muslim, and 20% people who are following traditional religions. And people get along in general. It doesn't have the problems that a lot of the countries are, and a lot of African countries are going to Tanzania to learn about how Tanzania was able to make a nationality out of this diversity. And it's definitely something that we saw as a real theme while we were there, and that the Tanzanians are very proud of. And I talked last week about our two guides on the safari, for instance, Bashiri. I didn't mention much about Edward. Now, Edward is a Christian and Bashiri is a Muslim. Edward is from two different tribes, his mother and father from different tribes, and Bashiri from two completely other different tribes. Again, his parents intermarrying, and yet they're best of friends, and that's something that we saw fairly commonly when we were there. So I just wanted to put that into context. The hospital is fairly heavily subsidized, because people can see a doctor for 1,000 shillings, and 1,000 shillings is, there's 1,250 shillings to the dollar, so 1,000 shillings is about 80 cents. But to put that into perspective, we met a pastor later on whose basically his monthly salary was 60,000 shillings, and school teacher whose monthly salary is 90,000 shillings. So roughly less than $60 and less than $90. So it is not a wealthy country, as I talked about last week. Here Sarah talks about orthopedic surgery within the hospital.
We heard about the charity cases that came over from Mount Meru Hospital, which is the government hospital in town. There was an enormous bus accident about a month ago, and there were 75 people in a 30-seater bus. 48 people were killed on the spot, and the rest of them were very severely injured. They all got taken to Mount Meru Hospital, and in the orthopedic ward there is a room full of people lying in traction, with their femurs in traction, so with bags of, and they have honestly bags of rocks hanging at the ends of their beds to try and pull their legs out into straight, because they have no other orthopedic surgery. So Marilla went over there and, selected people who were going to really benefit from having orthopedic surgery. And so that's what he's been doing this week, is doing a lot of these, nailing of things.
We also have a high rate of children who have legs that are not straight because of the natural fluoride which is coming from the volcanic soil, and so they're able to straighten for about 150,000 shillings, or less than $150, the legs of a child, which is something that they're also doing with their orthopedic knowledge. And you can even get a complete hip replacement surgery. That's more expensive. That would be $2,500, but that compares to over $100,000 in the United States, based on my wife's experience from last fall.
We have a lot of problem here with burns. Everyone still cooks over open fires. We have a lot of problems, especially with kids. This lady is an epileptic, and she had a seizure, and she fell in a fire. So she's quite badly burnt down her arm. Okay. So she's been brought from Karatu, around Karatu, which is where you guys
We
would
were
have
just
gone.
there.
You've gone
we went
through there.
there.
To go to Ngorongoro, huh?
Yeah.
And so she's from that area, and she comes here now, and she's been with us certainly since I've been here, which is 6 weeks ago. And she gets dressed every second day. That's her little baby over there. Yeah. Toto, hajambo mtoto. Amepona. Amepata nafuu. Sasa, shikamoo mama.
You have to love the welcoming nature of the Tanzanian people. Here's a little sound clip when we were walking by the room of an older gentleman. Chikamo is a greeting of respect.
Oh, yeah.
You would greet an elder that way.
Oh, yeah.
So it's like the regular greeting, but more intended for an elder.
Why are we walking just on the road? Why aren't we coming in to greet them?
How are you?
Very good.
I'm sorry, we should have said good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Habari za asubuhi.
Jambo nyingi. Karibuni kwetu.
Asante.
Lini mmekuja kwetu?
When did you arrive in Tanzania?
Sunday.
Saa 4 today.
Sunday.
Sunday, Jumapili.
Jumapili.
You are very much welcome.
Thank you.
Asante.
I'm glad to have all your friendship with all of you. Especially through Sarah.
Habari za mazoezi.
We are going to start today, but Mr. Mariba said that it is important if I get painkiller first.
Na mimi nilikwambia
Ulisema
asante.
And then after half an hour's time, we start our exercise.
Na alisemaje kuhusu mazoezi kwenye kitanda?
Alisema the same thing, the same what you told me the other day.
Yeah.
So you are very, very...
This guy had cannulated hip screws. He's been lying in bed for too long, and it's pretty difficult for him to start moving again. But he's going to start moving again.
How soon are you going back?
When will you return?
How many days is it?
12 more days.
Kumi?
Whatever.
Bado wana siku 12.
We are sorry that you are on bed. Otherwise, we would have welcomed you in our home.
So that looks to be about 2 minutes by my watch from introduction to invitation to his house, and that gives you some idea about the hospitality of the people of Tanzania. This caused some problems in misunderstandings, both in ours, trying to set up our trip, and also in some other trips we heard about. When we went to the Maasai Girls' School, which I'll talk about later, they told us a story about the bishop from Germany wrote down and asked if he could come and visit, and they never replied because the idea that he wouldn't be welcome to come and visit was so strange that they didn't think about the fact that they would have to tell him he was welcome. They just assumed that he would know. So it tells you a little bit about that culture. And we also learned something about AIDS and HIV and how prevalent that is in Tanzania.
So the rate, the official rate that the Tanzanian government talks about is 12%. In Monduli at an antenatal clinic there, they tested it up to 25%. It was up to 25% of a sort of a blind study.
25% of the adult population?
For that one, it was that 25% of the population of mamas who were coming into antenatal clinic. Down in Mererani, which is a mining town, for the guys between the age of 19 and 40, the purported rate of HIV infection down there is 80%. 80%. It's a Wild West mining town.
Wow.
It's just it's lawless, and this is one of the effects of a lawless society in this day and age. But 80%, it's crazy. Tanzania is losing a huge percentage of their teachers and their nurses through dying from HIV/AIDS.
Losing teachers and nurses seemed not to make any sense to us because it seemed like it'd be a segment of the population that was particularly educated and knowledgeable. But we learned a little later that one of the cultural things that happens in Tanzania is that the men, and we were told this about the Maasai, but we heard that's more true in general, expect to come home and have sex every night. So we found out that perhaps the reason why the Maasai are practicing polygamy is the women's idea. Just a guess there, but polygamy, by the way, is illegal. Even though we did meet someone in last week's show who had 2 wives, and there was somebody else in the neighborhood who had 3. But basically, even if they're away from home, if they're a miner up in the northern reaches, or if they're a teacher or a nurse whose work often brings them away from home, fidelity to your marriage is not something that is culturally expected. And therefore, these people are getting sick while away from home and then bringing it home, and then the whole family is affected. The next stop on our trip was at the local market. As we were leaving Sealy, and we again stopped at one of them local markets as we're driving through. And this is a poor part of town, but I enjoyed getting out at some of these markets where they're selling various things. And unlike the vendors who we saw who were so high pressure in the tourist areas, we were very free to stroll around, and we met one fellow, I wish I had a recording of this, but it didn't come out, who was selling a sugar cane for 100 shillings, or about 8 cents for a piece of sugar cane, about a little longer than a foot. And he said, "Come, taste Africa." And I had 1 coin, so I bought a piece that would basically cut into 5 pieces, and he said, "Well, do you have another coin? Because there were 4 more of us." And I didn't, so he gave us that piece. So definitely a generous people, and very fun to be in that area. I didn't know how to eat sugarcane until I had it then. And we learned the word wazungu in this market because the 5th member of our party, actually the pastor of my church, was separated from us, and he was able to follow us through the marketplace just because people would see him and point in the direction we headed and say, "Wazungu." The white people went that way. So we were out there past where the tourists go. Similarly, when we got back to town, just blocks from where the tourist areas are and where we were running into all the vendors, we went out to the central market in Arusha, which sounds a little like this. And we went from there to a village called Kikarara. And Kikarara is between Moshi and Old Moshi, up the slopes of Kilimanjaro. It's a mountain village, and we were there again because of AIDS. We wanted to have some contact with and be able to support a church that was doing something about the AIDS crisis. And this is a church that is caring for 130 orphans of AIDS. There are studies believe 25 million orphans from AIDS in Africa, and this is somebody who is doing something about it. We were able to bring monetary support for them to help them, enable them to let all the kids go to school over the next year, and then also to help the pastor buy a used car so he could get around to some of the different places he needed to. And they greeted us with a welcome that was overwhelming. We were planning on meeting the pastor at the bottom of the hill, and he would show us which dirt road to take up the top of the hill, and instead there was a whole van full of people, and they really pack a lot of people in. No seatbelt laws in Tanzania, with kids there giving us flower leis, and with ladies of the church who were greeting us with the high-pitched, what you'd call uvulation, which I can't do, but here's a little clip of what it sounds like, a joyful noise made in Tanzania. hear that over the normal applause, or what we consider normal applause. And then when we got up to the top of the hill, here were all the rest of the kids, and they sang us songs of welcome, and then we had a chance to introduce ourselves, and I was actually able to use a little of that Swahili that I had studied.
Jina langu Chris Christensen. Nila sema Kiswahili kidogo. Kidogo sana. Hamjambo. I work with computers and with the internet at home.
Or in English, my name is Chris Christensen. I speak a little Swahili, very little Swahili. And how are you all? And then I've learned that I would say that I work with computers. I would say I'm a computer fundi. And we had a chance there to spend about 3 days hiking up and down the foothills of Kilimanjaro, visiting people, which is quite a hike, and enjoying the lush countryside and the warm hospitality of the people we stayed with, Mr. Mate, who offered his house for us to stay at. We had a chance to play with the orphans in somewhat chaos, as we brought frisbees and balloons that went over really well, and we sang songs with them. I sat next to a couple kids who stand out in my memory. Marta, who was trying to teach me more Swahili and laughing at what I knew or how I could repeat it. And then Baraka is one kid who made a real impression on us. A kid whose English was very good. He's about 12 years old and bright as all get out. Real smart kid, very personable, and just a winning smile. And we're in a church setting, so one of the ladies in our group asked Baraka, was he planning on being a pastor someday, which seems like an appropriate question, but one of the elders took her aside later on and said, well, Baraka has HIV. His mother and father and older sister have already died of HIV. But basically, he's not on any medicine right now. He wouldn't be until he got worse just because of the cost of it. And he won't live that long. So that put a real face on the AIDS crisis for us in a very difficult way. We also met other kids. Frank is another kid who really stands out for me. He's an older kid, and he got to go to primary school. And Tanzania is trying to get more and more education. They've required primary school right now, but because they've required it but don't have a lot of money to fund it, we met a primary teacher, for instance, who had 96 kids in her classroom. We talked to somebody else who their classroom had 2 books in it. For about 100 kids. So the resources are difficult, but secondary school is even harder to get into. There just aren't that many secondary schools. They're building more, and we saw a new secondary school that was built there and went up the hill to the Lutheran secondary school, private school at the top of the hill, in what used to be the German fort in Old Moshi. Got a chance to use my German translating old German headstones. But Frank would love to go on to secondary school. He would love to go on to what for us is roughly the equivalent of high school. It's about 6 years, and it goes into what for us would be the first year of college. But simply doesn't have the money to do that. And Frank doesn't have real great English skills yet because secondary school is in English. And so kids who've had secondary school are really good at English. But those who haven't may not have picked up, even though they've been taught it since kindergarten. If they went to that would be private. This church, for instance, runs a free kindergarten, or they've been taught it since first grade in primary school. But winning smile, just a real neat kid. So we had a chance to do that and get to know them and get to know especially a lot of the elders here. Who one was the chairman of the village, and one was on the board of the government secondary school and primary school, and one was on the board of the private secondary school at the top of the hill. One used to be a ranger with the Tanzanian Park Service in the Kilimanjaro Park. So really enjoyed getting to know them. We went down to Paul, who is the chairman of the village, down to his shop, and we're were shopping at one point, and just to put prices in perspective there, and we talked about how much Tanzanians make. We were in his shop and we were looking at some jewelry that he had made, that he had created, and I was thinking, well, I'm not really in the market for that, but I saw some earrings that were nice, and I looked at them and said, well, 15,000 shillings, that'd be, less than $15. Gee, that looks pretty nice. And then I realized I had put on an extra zero in my head. It was 1,500 shillings. It was a little over $1, probably like $1.25 for a pair of earrings. Well, sure, I'm going to get them at that price. You just wonder how anybody could make a living, but things are not quite as expensive. It was interesting for us after the church service was over. We all filed outside while singing a hymn, and then we're all standing in a circle out there. And suddenly, one of the elders, who we had happened to meet, Samuel, starts picking up vegetables and eggs and what looked like to us like beans, but were ground nuts or peanuts, and starts auctioning them off. And I can follow that he's doing an auction because I can understand the numbers that he's doing. And suddenly he's auctioning off things. And what happened is, if you've made a pledge for supporting the church, but you don't have cash, in this society where a lot of people have land, people have brought in farm produce, and somebody is buying it from them to help contribute towards their offering for the church. And people would actually bought things and then gave it to us since we were the honored guests. They also had a ceremony. This is the Chaga tribe is the region we're in, and the Chaga have what they call Chaga cake, which is actually roast goat, head and all, eyeballs, tongue sticking out, but it was good meat. It was a fatty meat, but they were trying to talk to us about this wonderful honor, and I'm just so distracted because in the background I hear the choir practicing, and again the beautiful singing in Tanzania.
Well roasted, very, very carefully. Customer, somebody who is very, very honorable, and who has done something to us, and in recognition of that, we give him what we are having here.
After we left Kigarara, we went to the Maasai girls' school. It's a school for Maasai and other pastoral tribes. By law, no school can be more than 70% members of one tribe, but it's largely Maasai. And it's girls who have been selected and are brought on scholarship to this school, in part to change the lot of the girl within the Maasai culture. Typically within that culture, a girl might be married off as young as 14 years old. And the combination of that and having kids fairly early in an arranged marriage, and also radical female circumcision, can lead to a number of health issues, as well as other issues. A girl can challenge if she's been in arranged marriage, she can challenge it, but only at the age of 18 or older. But anyway, this school is bringing girls who are bright, who would probably otherwise not be able to afford secondary education, and bringing them here and sending them on then hopefully to university, and sending them back then to their tribe as teachers, as nurses, as lawyers. So quite an interesting school, and quite a effect on the culture, and their value of education for girls has really been increasingly perceived through this school in that culture over the 10 years or so that the school has been operating. And again, a lot of little quiet girl voices, and then we go into the choir, and the choir sounds a little like this. And I apologize that the microphone isn't quite up to the challenge of the big sound of the choir. and that song again with only vocals. And then here they did another song for us. I'll just play a part of that was just vocals and Maasai drums. We spent the next few days on the trip doing a service project, installing some screens on the chapel in the Timaini University, which is a new university that is a Lutheran university there. And again, the government is looking for help opening up schools because not long ago they had only, I think, 5,000 students in college, I think is the number that we heard. And the population of Tanzania is about 30 million, about the same size as the population of California. And we spent about 3 days there actually doing a service project and wishing we had power for power tools, but power goes off quite often in Tanzania and not quite on the days we expected. And so we were using hand drills and hand screwdrivers and such to and building some screens to put them on the university chapel, as well as we had helped bring some funds to make possible some new roofing on the chapel. And then we also went out, and I'm covering this whole trip fairly quickly. I do have a long trip journal that I've started to put up, and I'll try and put up the rest of the weekend on christuix.com, which is my personal blog. In the travel section, I'll put up the rest of my trip journal. I'll also put links to the show notes to the letters that came back that our pastor wrote from Tanzania. He's a very good writer and a funny writer, and captured a lot of things that I'm not capturing here, but you're hearing some of the sounds that don't come out in the writing. We also met with members of the New Life Band, and the New Life Band is another singing group, and it's a Christian singing group, and these are started as 15-year-old boys started this as an option for kids other than gangs, which is what they saw at the time in Tanzania. And this was about 15, 20 years ago. And they go out and they tour for up to a year at a time, and they're raising money to build yet another secondary school, again for Maasai or other kids who are have more difficulty getting access to education. And we had a chance to meet with them and to go out and tour the school site out in the countryside around Arusha. So great emphasis going on right now on education in Tanzania and trying to get more education for the people to try and raise up the standard of living and to try and deal with some of the issues that Tanzania is facing. That gives you a little insight into the trip that I took, and I hope it gives you a little insight into the people. They are certainly wonderful people, and the pastor, God bless, who's the head of the church in Kikarara, just wonderful smile, and we just enjoyed meeting the elders there. We enjoyed meeting the various people we met in Tanzania, and the members of JM Tours that took us around also were a joy to be with. And it just really is a different kind of trip once you get away from the tourist segment. You see some things, obviously, like the AIDS and the HIV that are not as attractive and that are much more difficult issues, but you also see the wonderful people. And being part of that, I considered to be a privilege, being a part of their lives even for just a few days. On that note, we'll wind this up. I have a few show notes for you. I'd like to encourage everybody to give comments on this episode. I'm assuming there will be one or two. I'll put a link in the show notes to the discussion boards, amateurtraveler.com/boards. Again, I do have a video up there. I did get that up of the cheetah kill that we saw. And so look in the show notes for that, or look in the boards for that. Also, feel free to send me an email to host@amateurtraveler.com. I did get an email this week that I'd like to read. Prashant wrote me, just wanted to say what a great podcast you have put together. I've been listening to quite a few podcasts on the internet and recently stumbled across photography/travel areas, which I'm very interested in. I have to say yours is one of the most professional, informative, and entertaining ones on the net. I suppose sometimes it must feel like you're talking to yourself, so I thought I would say a quick thanks for your effort. I've only listened to a couple so far and really enjoyed the travel photography interview. I thought the questions you asked were spot on. Thanks very much. It does sometimes feel like I'm talking to myself, and I really do appreciate all the feedback that I get, positive and negative. Although I haven't really gotten a lot of negative feedback, but I really do appreciate the emails and the posts on the discussion board and such, and it makes it a lot easier for me to motivate myself to get the show out after a long week at work, to put in the sometimes even 6 to 8 hours that it takes on the weekend for me to put together a podcast. And one of the reasons it does take a little longer, just for those of you who are new listeners, is there is a version of the podcast available for those of you who use the iTunes software on either Windows or Mac, or who have a video or photo iPod, and that is the iTunes enhanced version, which does include pictures that go along with the show. I also do produce a second show, which is the same name, the Amateur Traveler Video Edition, which is not the same content in video because you don't really need to see pictures of me, but instead it's video that goes along with the stories I've told, and I did just put out an episode of the video edition. It's on a separate feed last week, and that was the first of probably a couple videos on a recent trip to Las Vegas, about 4 minutes long, walking through some of the casinos in Las Vegas. So you might want to check that out. Again, thank you very much for listening to the show. Thanks for supporting it and for encouraging me to do it. And I'm going to leave you with yet another song. You can tell what I fell in love with in Tanzania, and this is a choir piece from the church at Kikarara. Thanks for listening.
The best and the brightest served up daily by the sharpest minds in content delivery, pod show, and limelight.